welcome to the 2017 release of the CSI research that we've conducted. Now, just to give you some context around the research, our aim with the research is not to tell people what they do right or what they do wrong. It is to build the capacity of practitioners in Africa. We find that people at this point in time still don't even share M&E reports, what to say about impact reports. And so we find that the practice gets stuck. There's a few people that knows what works or not. And so the whole idea around the trend research is to build the capacity of practitioners, both on the investment side as well as on the development side. Copies of our previous presentations, we've been doing this for almost 10 years, are still available on social media if you want to follow the threads. And our context for the research, I think, is very important. We don't just look at South Africa. A lot of our clients are multinationals. They work in Kenya, they work in Nigeria, they work in Ghana. And so we first start with a global context. And I'll show you today why that is important, not just from an Africa perspective, but from an international perspective. We then look at from a global perspective to an African perspective to a South African perspective. Our research methodology is very integrated, both quantitative and qualitative, and I'll share with you specifically we use published reports, we use literary research, we use focus groups, we use personal interviews, and then of course, because we've been doing impact assessments for the last 10 years, a lot of our confirmation of trends come out of the actual impact assessments we do on strategies, on portfolios, and on programs. So to just set a context of what happened last year, I'm going to start from the bottom up, globally. And that is why I said it's important to understand the context in which we work. Particularly the NGO sector uses an international community to raise funds from. Now, with Brexit and with the elections in the US, and already within the first 30 days that Trump came into power, he was very clear on where US aid is going to go. Similarly, DFID from the UK is very clear what they will spend their money on going forward. And guess what? It's not going to be in Africa. Why? Because there's this global phenomenon of national patriotism, which means America for the Americans, Britain for the British, which means Africa will have to look for its own resources. So understand why we have to look at it from a global perspective, because it directly impacts on what we do in South Africa. Then we look at Africa. Now let me share with you one of the biggest trends in the rest of Africa is that NGOs are being shut down and heavily legislated and governed. Why? Because they represent the civil society. Why? Because that fights the process of democracy. So the only way governments can control the process internally is to control civil society and the organizations and institutions it represents. So although in South Africa we may have a democracy and a very vibrant civil society with institutions, NGOs, NPOs, that does not speak to the rest of Africa. And so this is one of the big trends this year we're also going to share with you is what happens in that development sector, in the NGO sector, when they're being stricter governed. Now let's look at South Africa. And now you need to understand how what happens around us influence our investment and development practice. The whole Fees Must Fall campaign put a completely different spotlight, for instance, on education. particularly higher education. Government's been driving ECD at the cost of higher education, and we saw it play out. So the unintended consequences of a government policy on society was huge. So understand again, when we look at trends, these are the kind of things we want to interpret to make sense of for practitioners on the ground. So the drivers of change, and that is our theme for this year, has meant that everything has changed. The whole world has changed. The way we look at the world, the voices of the world, civil society's view of where they live, in which country they live, has changed completely. And then we thought, does that reflect the daily practice of our practitioners? And I can honestly say to you, after spending 6 months researching the trends, nothing has changed. So our theme for this year, last year, our theme was disruptive development. This year, our theme is everything has changed, but nothing has changed. Because we do not see the dynamism of society reflected in corporate social investment practice today. So the outcome of all of what I've just shared with you is that there's a much greater application of governance, of rules, of regulations that we have to live in. There's an increased focus on trying to understand what makes a difference. And there's an integration of society and strategy in the programs that we fund and run. And then there is this thing called social media that puts everything that we do, whether it was right or wrong, in the spotlight. Again, the whole world has changed. We've got new regulations. The B scorecards have changed. All of the whole context in which we operate have changed. And yet, our practice have stayed the same. So that is what I mean in saying that challenges are still very evident in our sector. Most probably the biggest one, and that is our biggest trend, for those of you who follow us on social media, that we set for this year and our forecast for next year, is that evidence is the biggest defining, most critical key success factor for our industry at the moment. But that means in order to provide evidence, we need the data, we need the information, we need monitoring, we need evaluation, we need impact assessments. And if your organization don't have these processes and systems, there's no evidence of what you've done nor what you've achieved. So collaboration has become key. If you're working in a big data space, you are dependent on a number of sources of information. And you're not set up to obtain that properly. It's going to be difficult to know what you're doing right or wrong. And then, of course, in this resource constraint environment, one of the biggest things is our struggling civil society, the NGO sector. It just seems that we're not getting to a very strong, capacitated sector that can actually take accountability as well as credibility for the work that they do. And then lastly, governance is still playing a big role. Whether it's King, whether it's the GRI, whether it's the IRC framework, whether it's the BEE framework, we've still got to operate and take cognizance of that. So the implications of this very, very fast changing industry is that the sector is at war at itself. We have got government making sure that they do what they do. We've got the private sector who's very clear on where they can make a difference. And then we've got civil society or the NGO sector just trying to serve both sectors in order to survive. Progress with evidence and sustainable outcomes is still not evident. Funders' propensity for risk remains limited, and there's a lack of co-funding, each one to his own. everybody works for themselves on their own programs for their own beneficiaries in their own geographic locations.